Hey everyone, get ready to step back in time tonight as we explore the wild, wonderful world of the medieval peasant wedding. It was a celebration unlike any other, where solemn vows mingled with the sounds of livestock, boisterous drunken uncles, and even the occasional spontaneous fistfight. Trust me, it was a deeply rustic fever dream. Before we jump in, please hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments below, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing our global community come together. Alright, settle in, maybe dim the lights, and put on a fan for that perfect background hum. Let's start this journey. Medieval peasant weddings, a colorful picture of rural life. Weddings have always been a momentous event in every culture and era. However, if you imagine a medieval wedding with pristine white dresses, romantic vows under shimmering candlelight, and lavish banquets, you're picturing a noble's wedding. For ordinary peasants, the vast majority of Europe's population at the time, a wedding was an entirely different picture. Rustic, noisy, chaotic, but full of life and community spirit. It was a rare event that combined sacred vows, animal noises, drunk uncles, and sometimes even impromptu brawls, all blended into a wild, rural fever dream. In medieval villages, the concept of sparkling invitations, precious parchment, or wax seals was completely alien. There weren't even angry ravens dropping scrolls on rooftops to announce the news. A peasant wedding spread by only one method: rumor. It usually began with a small whisper by the village well. Did you hear? Tomas is marrying Beatrix. A day later, the news reached the baker, who told the miller, who told the midwife, and the midwife told everyone she met, regardless of whether they cared. By nightfall, even the sheep knew someone was getting married. Remarkably, the priest was always the last to know. In medieval peasant society, there was no such thing as not invited. If you were alive and within walking distance, you went. The reason wasn't because you were particularly close to the couple. The primary reason was that a wedding meant free food and drink, and possibly a brawl if things got too lively. The bride and groom didn't make a guest list. They had no control over who showed up. You might end up with 10 people or half the county. That was simply how it went. The more people, the more gifts. In a peasant economy, this could mean an extra chicken or a bag of turnips. Incredibly valuable when you were subsisting on gruel. Of course, you had to plan for guests to show up, but also for them not to. Some might have died, some might be drunk, others simply forgot. One man was still harvesting barley and didn't realize the entire wedding had happened without him. Because, let's be honest, the concept of time was fluid. Noon could mean any time between breakfast and dusk. There were no clocks, just the sun and people's vague ability to guess how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow. A peasant wedding venue was wherever there was space and fewer than 5 pigs. Ideally, the churchyard, not inside the church. That was for noble weddings and high-maintenance saints. Peasants had to make do with what they had, which often meant exchanging vows by a gravestone, under a tree, or next to a chicken coop cum performance stage. Green grass was a luxury. Most of the time, the ground was either parched and cracked, or waterlogged and full of unexpected holes. If it had rained recently, and it often did, the entire ceremony took place on a muddy expanse, generously seasoned with manure. Guests attended in their wedding boots, which were their everyday boots, but with a resigned expression. There were no chairs, no bunting, no altars made of reclaimed oak. People stood, squatted, or leaned precariously against a creaking fence. Sometimes someone brought a bench, and the elders would immediately commandeer it like uncrowned kings. Everyone else just tried not to fall into a ditch. As for decorations, mostly natural and largely weeds. If someone strung a few flowers or ribbons around a fence post, that was considered Martha Stewart-level ambition. The rest of the scene was filled by animals, dogs sniffing everywhere, chickens running underfoot, and the occasional wandering goat making a surprise appearance as a backdrop for the betrothal. And then there was the smell. Pigs in the next field, sheep nearby, the faint but persistent aroma of cabbage stew bubbling in someone's pot. Combined with the scent of sweat and beery breath, it wasn't a wedding ambience so much as a medieval perfume sample board. But people came anyway, because the setting didn't matter. This was a rare respite from the grim grind of survival. A wedding could be held in a puddle surrounded by compost, and it would still be better than weeding barley all day. By the time the bride and groom stood before the priest, most of the guests were either itchy, sunburned, or 3 tankards deep in ale. That was fine, because the ceremony itself wasn't some Shakespearean event. It was brief. It was awkward. And if the priest had other places to be afterward, it was even briefer. For medieval peasants, marriage wasn't about flowers, rings, or tearful vows. It was primarily about contractual clarity. By the 12th century, the church had begun to require clerical involvement. But really, many couples considered themselves married as soon as they declared their consent before witnesses. I take you for mine, and you take me for yours. That was the core. Very practical romance, and tax-related. Some ceremonies involved a blessing and a few Latin mumbles. Most featured no kissing, not out of modesty, but because nobody wanted to put their mouth on someone else's after 6 days without soap. The priest might make a sign of the cross, say a prayer, then hurry off to his next duty, like helping to dig a grave or yelling at a goose. The medieval church was versatile. There were no wedding rings, unless someone found a bent copper trinket or inherited a mystery heirloom. Some couples exchanged small mementos, a piece of cloth, a knife, or a coin to seal the deal. Others just shook hands and hoped no one backed out before dusk. Consent was key. Both parties had to verbally agree and in front of others. If the bride stayed silent and looked like she was about to bolt, technically the priest had to postpone. But usually a stern look from a parent or a reminder of the exchanged dowry moved things along quickly. And that was it. No organ music, no scattered petals, no lengthy speeches. Just 2 peasants standing in a muddy yard saying yes to a shared future of labor, screaming children, and, if lucky, a decent blanket. But simple as it was, the weight of the promise was real. In that moment, surrounded by friends, livestock, and curious children, they tied themselves together, not with lace or incense, but with words. And in the medieval world, words had power, especially when followed by ale. When a peasant said feast, they meant, today we have more than one kind of food, and nobody had to steal it. The post-wedding meal wasn't catered. There was no menu, no servers. There was, however, a large communal pot that had been simmering for hours, containing roughly half the village's hopes and all its root vegetables. The centerpiece of the meal was usually a stew bubbling in a cauldron the size of a small cart. In it went cabbage, leeks, onions, barley, turnips, maybe some dried beans, and if you were truly blessed, a bit of meat. A chicken if someone was feeling generous or reckless. Otherwise, the flavor depended on salt or fate. Guests didn't sit at tables. They found a rock, a bench, or a particularly sturdy dog. Bowls were passed around, and if you didn't bring one, you ate with your hands or borrowed from a neighbor. Spoons were wooden, communal, or merely theoretical. Fingers did most of the work. The drinks were better. Ale was plentiful, home-brewed, and stronger than expected. It went down fast, was slightly bitter, and made even burnt stew taste magnificent. Water was technically an option, but most people avoided it as it was usually a bacteria cocktail. Ale was safer and more celebratory. Bread, when available, was dense enough to stun a pig. It could be fresh and sour or old and hard enough to be used as a weapon. Cheese made an appearance, but only if the cows had been particularly giving that week. There was no dessert unless someone brought berries or dried fruit, and nobody trusted berries. Still, it was abundance by peasant standards. A second bowl, a third, that was luxury. Children ran around with crusts of bread in their hands. Elders gnawed contentedly, gums be damned. Dogs roamed underfoot, getting more food than usual and less appreciation than they deserved. And despite the lack of silver platters or fancy cuts of meat, the feast meant something. It was a chance to be full, to rest, to celebrate something other than surviving the winter. Because when you lived a life dictated by seasons, plowing, and random plagues, any excuse to eat together and laugh loudly was a triumph, even if it tasted mostly of boiled cabbage. Forget blenders and monogram towels. At a medieval peasant wedding, the gift registry was simple. Bring whatever you could carry, preferably alive or edible. Wedding gifts weren't about sentiment. They were about survival. Guests brought what they had: a few eggs, a hard lump of cheese, a chicken with its legs tied, or in truly generous cases, a small bag of grain. These weren't gifts in the modern sense, but rather practical investments in the couple's new life. Because nothing says congratulations on your lifelong binding contract, like half a dozen turnips. Occasionally, someone would bring something a bit more creative, an old home missing its handle, a wooden spoon with bite marks, a lame goat with poor eyesight. But even that was better than showing up empty-handed. Arriving without a gift meant you were either very poor or very bold. And either way, people would notice. Money was scarce. Most peasants didn't see coins regularly, and when they did, they hoarded them like dragons. So, the idea of giving money as a wedding gift was laughable. Goods, not coins, made the world go round. If someone gave the bride a jug of ale or a fresh loaf of bread, they were practically royalty. Sometimes, gifts were recycled. And yes, that was as medieval as it got. A goose gifted at your wedding might reappear at your cousin's wedding a year later, slightly older and angrier. There were rumors of a clay pot that had been passed around for over a decade. Nobody remembered where it came from. Nobody dared to keep it. But the gifts weren't just for the couple. They played a role in community relations. Giving something useful showed you were invested in the new family's success. It signaled goodwill, participation, and perhaps the hope that when it was your turn to marry, someone would reciprocate with a particularly plump chicken. And despite the randomness and regifting, there was a warmth to it. These weren't luxuries, but they were what people could spare. In a world where most people had little, giving anything was an act of generosity, even if it squawked all the way there. Every medieval village had its cast of characters, and they all showed up at weddings, uninvited but undeniable. Think of it as a social gathering blended with reality TV, but with no cameras and more goats. First, there was the village loudmouth, usually an older woman who knew everyone's business and had no filter. She'd start with blessings on the happy couple and end with, though we all remember what happened last harvest behind the bakers. She wasn't trying to stir the pot. She was the pot. Then there was the local wise woman, part healer, part witch, and full-time purveyor of rumors. She'd bless the couple with a mysterious herb nobody recognized and mumble something like, "May your cows always give milk," unless they don't. Everyone nodded solemnly. Nobody wanted to make eye contact. You'd also find the retired soldier who hadn't fought in 30 years but still wore part of his dented helmet and told the same story about a skirmish near France that probably never happened. He'd yell at the bride and groom and immediately fall over. And of course, the drunk uncle. Every village had one. Red-nosed, overly emotional, and prone to yelling, "Love is war," while trying to dance with someone's grandmother. He'd bring a bent spoon as a gift or a suspiciously weak jug of ale. It was tradition anyway. But beyond the distinct personalities, the real engine of a wedding was gossip. Weddings were prime real estate for juicy whispers to breed. Who was late? Who looked too cozy with the shepherd? Who brought a gift that suspiciously resembled the one they received last year? Nothing escaped notice. If the bride's dress had a stain, someone had an entire theory. If the groom looked pale, someone would claim he was cursed. The chatter began during the ceremony and would spread for weeks, woven into bread lines, passed over milking pails, and etched into the village's collective memory. And honestly, people lived for it. Life was hard enough. Gossip was free. If you've ever been to a wedding where no one hired a babysitter, now imagine that. But with more mud, fewer teeth, and absolutely no supervision. That was the medieval peasant wedding. Children were everywhere. Not sitting politely, not daintily nibbling bread. No, they were tearing through the crowd like wild, sugar-crazed squirrels, fueled by stolen crusts and pure chaos. And no one stopped them. Not because the adults didn't care, but because they were busy eating, drinking, and avoiding eye contact with in-laws. With no structured games or toys, the children got creative. They raced sticks down puddles, threw mud at chickens, dared each other to touch the priest's donkey. They used turnips as projectiles and hay bales as crash pads. At least one child always ended up near the stew pot, mercifully not in it, but close enough to prompt questions. Toddlers toddled directly into the ceremony. Babies were tied to hips or simply set down on the ground like sacks. A child would cry every 5 minutes, either because they tripped, were bitten by another child, or had their only snack snatched by a passing dog. No one panicked. This was normal. The bride and groom usually ignored the pandemonium. Occasionally, The bride would grab a child by the scruff of its neck mid-vow and hand it to someone with a directive, yours. The child, unfazed, would simply run off like a tiny medieval goblin. Sometimes there was a group of older children who declared themselves overseers, dominating the younger ones with all the compassion of miniature feudal lords. No, you don't get to sit there. Yes, we're allowed to take your bread. It was a grimy, unsanitary version of Lord of the Flies. In truth, a wedding was one of the few times children were allowed, even encouraged, to go completely feral. It was understood, let them burn off energy while the adults did the same. If they didn't come home scratched, bruised, and covered in someone else's breadcrumbs, did they even go to the wedding? By the end of the day, most children were passed out in hay piles, filthy and exhausted. A few sustained minor injuries, but no one was surprised. In the grand tradition of medieval peasant weddings, music was less a performance and more whatever noise someone could coax out of an object. If you were lucky, a local with a fiddle would show up. If you were very lucky, he knew more than one tune. The most common musician was that guy. Every village had one who claimed to be able to play something: a flute, a pipe, or a lute with 3 strings and a dream, sorely out of tune. Sometimes, instruments were improvised: a pot lid and a stick, 2 jugs, or just enthusiastic whistling through missing teeth. If nobody brought an instrument, then congratulations. You had a chorus of ale-soaked uncles, belting out the one wedding song they all vaguely remembered. The lyrics were vague, slightly inappropriate, and repeated until someone passed out or forgot the words, whichever came first. Drums, when present, were anything that made a noise when struck: buckets, barrels. Once, a fat goose in a sack. Stomping feet to the rhythm was also a favorite, especially useful as it doubled as both dancing and rat-scaring. The repertoire was narrow. Most songs fell into one of 3 categories: love songs, where someone inevitably died at the end; drinking songs, where everyone died at the end; and historical ballads, where everyone died and lost their sheep. Nobody truly cared about skill. Volume was more important than tune. If you were loud and enthusiastic, you were a musician. If you had rhythm, you were a professional. If you could clap on beat and not fall over, you were a legend. Children often joined in, adding their high-pitched wails to the cacophony. Dogs barked along. Occasionally, a rooster would attempt a solo. It was chaotic, and yet, somehow it worked. The sound was messy, off-key, sometimes alarming, but it filled the air with joy, or at least noise, and that was enough. For peasants who rarely heard music beyond church bells or rain on a leaky roof, this was magic. Brief, messy magic. When the music started, and by music, we mean the rhythmic banging and someone whistling off-key, it was only a matter of time before the dancing began. And by dancing, we don't mean elegant waltzes or courtly steps. We mean stomping, arm-waving, and vaguely coordinated jumping performed with the unbridled energy of people who had spent the last 6 months bent over a barley field. There was no formal choreography in peasant villages, no rehearsed routines. What you had was instinctive celebration, profoundly chaotic, but undeniably heartfelt. People formed circles, lines, or something in between and just moved. There might be clapping, backslapping, whooping, and foot stomping, often all at once, and rarely in sync. Feet pounded the ground with enough force to startle birds and churn up mud. Arms were flung around shoulders. Backs were slapped, sometimes accidentally. Elders clapped from the sidelines, cheering on anyone who managed to stay upright for more than 3 songs. Some villagers attempted more elaborate steps, usually those who had visited bigger towns or heard tales from a wandering dancer 5 years prior. These brave souls would try a spin or a jump, only to land awkwardly and pretend they meant to sit down. Footwear was optional. By the second song, most people had either kicked theirs off, lost it, or realized it was slowing them down. Bare feet slapping into the muddy earth became part of the percussion section. Occasionally, someone would fall. Everyone would cheer. Falling was part of the ritual. The bride and groom were, of course, expected to participate. The crowd would chant, whoop encouragement, and sometimes push them into the center of the circle. They danced while blushing, giggling, or silently praying for someone else to take the spotlight. Children joined in too, creating their own moves, mostly involving spinning until they fell over. One particularly daring child would often start a conga line. Nobody knew where they learned it. They just did. And while nobody would call it graceful, it was profoundly real. It was full of joy. It was how peasants said, "We're alive. We're fed. We're together. Let's move." If music was optional and dancing was impromptu, then ale was absolutely mandatory. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without it. And not just a pint or two. We're talking jugs, barrels, buckets, and anything else that could hold fermented liquid without leaking too quickly. Water was considered suspect, mostly because it tended to contain unpleasant things like frogs, dirt, or dysentery. Ale, on the other hand, had been boiled during brewing, which made it safer and much more fun. It wasn't always strong, but it could be, depending on the brewer and how little they valued subtlety. Most weddings featured a mix of weaker ale, suitable for children and the very old, and a stronger brew that could fill a grown man in 3 tankards. The latter was often kept in large wooden vats and ladled out like soup. You didn't ask what was in it. You just drank it and hoped you remembered the rest of the evening. Cups were passed freely. If you had your own, great. If not, you shared. Nobody worried about germs, mostly because the concept of germs hadn't been invented, and also because ale felt clean. That tingling, burning sensation, they said it was disinfectant or possibly blindness. With each round of drinking, the crowd grew louder, looser, and a little more chaotic. Polite chuckles gave way to boisterous guffaws. Stories grew taller. People began complimenting the bride's smile or the groom's oddly shaped knees. Someone always started a drinking song, which then devolved into a shouting match, and then into a nap under a table. There was always one person who shouldn't have had that last tankard. The kind who started by singing and ended by vomiting behind a hay bale. And yet, nobody judged. It was just part of the ritual. In a world of back-breaking labor, harsh winters, and ever-present death, ale wasn't just a beverage. It was social glue. It made people talk, laugh, confess, and occasionally fall into a trough. And at a wedding, it served an essential purpose, turning a sacred union into a party that nobody would remember clearly, but everyone would remember fondly. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without a healthy dose of chaos. Not necessarily planned chaos, but the kind that simmers just below the surface until someone's elbow hits the wrong ale jug or someone else flirts with the wrong cousin. Let's start with the flirtation. Weddings were gold mines for eligible bachelors and bachelorettes. You had music, drink, food, technically, and a field full of eligible peasants who had spent the last few months covered in mud and despair. A wedding offered a rare chance to see someone without soot on their face. It was basically medieval speed dating. Glances were exchanged. Flowers were awkwardly offered. A few brave souls attempted poetry, usually rhyming "hey" with "may," and quickly losing their nerve. The dance floor was prime flirtation territory, though most of the moves involved tripping over someone and pretending it was romance. Of course, not all flirtation was welcome, and that's where the brawls began. Most common causes: someone dancing too close to someone else's sweetheart, someone spilling ale on a borrowed tunic, someone insulting someone else's goat. Again, the brawls were rarely serious, mostly pushing, incoherent yelling, and the occasional wrestling match in the mud that nobody really tried to break up. By the end, both parties were usually too tired or too drunk to remember what they were fighting about. They'd shake hands, share a cup, and move on. Then there were the accidents. Wedding plus livestock plus ale equals unpredictable outcomes. Chickens were routinely stepped on. Children fell into barrels. Someone always tripped into the stew pot. Once, a goat got tangled in the bride's veil and dragged her 10 yards before anyone noticed. She was fine. The goat was applauded, but no one was surprised. Accidents were part of the fun. They gave the villagers stories to tell for years to come. Do you remember Tomas's wedding when old Magda sat on a beehive? Instant legend. And while the nobility had lavish feasts and rehearsed toasts, the peasants had spilled ale, accidental kisses, and mild head injuries. And somehow, that felt more authentic. At some point in every medieval peasant wedding, just after the 4th drinking song, but before the goat stole the bread, someone would look around and ask, "Hey, where did the bride and groom go?" This would be followed by knowing smiles, raised eyebrows, and older aunties nudging each other and muttering things like, "Well, they're not wasting time, are they?" because everyone knew exactly where the newly married couple was, or at least what they were doing. The consummation of the marriage was not just a tradition. It had significant legal importance. In medieval Christian Europe, a marriage wasn't considered fully valid until it was, to put it bluntly, officialized in the eyes of God and a lumpy straw mattress. Technically, some weddings even featured witnesses, a worrying combination of custom and voyeurism, though by the late Middle Ages, most villages wisely dispensed with that part. The newly married couple would typically sneak off to a barn or a back room or an attic someone had swept for the occasion. Privacy was relative. Locks didn't exist, and curtains were a luxury. But the important thing was the symbolic disappearance. The community understood. Let them disappear. Let them bond. Meanwhile, back at the party, the fun continued. The couple's absence didn't stop the dancing or the ale or the off-key singing. If anything, it gave everyone something to talk about. How long do you think they'll be? Betty tripped over her own boots. She looked like she knew what she was doing. Well, his mother says he's clumsy. When the couple finally reappeared, red-faced, disheveled, and vaguely triumphant, nobody said anything loudly, but everyone looked. The groom received back slaps. The bride received proud nods and unsolicited advice from women who had been married since the great turnip shortage of 1314. Some couples didn't come back at all. They fell asleep in the hay or decided that right now was a good time to start their happy family life early. No one blamed them. After months of labor and years of waiting, they had earned their brief reprieve from the noise, the mud, and the constant commentary of their neighbors. And while there was no honeymoon, that stolen private hour was the closest they were likely to get. The morning after a medieval peasant wedding was less a romantic sunrise and more a hangover with livestock. The music, the laughter, and the frantic goat chase were gone. In their place were aching feet, empty ale jugs, and the slow realization from the entire community that someone had definitely slept in a cabbage patch. Guests emerged from wherever they had collapsed. Hay piles, under carts, inside lean-tos, or simply curled up by the communal fire like large, snoring cats. Hair was askew. Tunics were mud-stained. One man was wearing someone else's tunic and didn't seem particularly keen to return it. The feasting area, if it could be called that, was now a battlefield, half-eaten bread, spilled ale, an overturned stew pot, and the unmistakable presence of a chicken that had clearly been there all night. Someone found a single shoe in a tree. Someone else had acquired a dog. The children were up, of course, bright-eyed and mud-caked, dragging sticks and singing snippets of wedding songs with made-up lyrics. A toddler walked by, proudly carrying a goose egg, and no one knew where it came from, or if the goose was okay. The bride and groom were probably still hiding. They would eventually reappear, disheveled, exhausted, and probably with hay in their hair, ready to begin a new life of shared chores, animal husbandry, and mild existential dread. But on this particular morning, they were allowed to maintain a legendary mystique. Those with stronger stomachs helped clean up. Bread crusts were salvaged, cups were stacked, barrels were rolled away. Others simply sat on logs, holding their heads and muttering prayers for silence, strong hot tea, or time travel. The priest walked by with a vaguely smug look. He hadn't partied. He remembered everything. And worse, he was ready to tell. Still, despite the mess, nobody complained. There was a quiet satisfaction in the aftermath. The wedding had happened. The couple was married. The village had gathered, danced, eaten, bled a little, and survived. That was enough. When you envision a medieval wedding, it's easy to be tempted by elegance, garlands, flowing gowns, sweet music drifting through the trees. And that may have happened somewhere. But for the peasants, the true legacy of a wedding was far simpler. It was mud, laughter, bruised knees, boiled cabbage, and community. These weddings weren't about prestige. They weren't performances designed to impress. There were no photographers, no planners, no mood boards. What there was, and what mattered, was presence. The whole village came, not just to witness a vow, but to participate in something rare, joy. Because peasant life in the Middle Ages wasn't just hard. It was relentless. Famine, disease, taxes, bad weather, and the occasional armed noble riding through your barley field. Joy was fleeting. Merriment was suspect. But a wedding was an exception, a communal pause in the chaos, a moment where mud-caked hands held bread instead of tools, and voices rose in song instead of curses at rocks. Even if the stew was bland, the ale ran out, or someone got accidentally kicked by a donkey, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the village had gathered to say, "These two are now facing the world together. Let's all cheer and spill things in their honor." And so, the legacy of the peasant wedding isn't recorded in stained glass or illuminated manuscripts. It lives on in the stories told by the fire, in the song hummed in the next harvest, in the shared smile between a couple months later over a bowl of stew, now with calloused hands and shared debts. It's in the muddy footprint, the goose-related injury, the whispered rumors that somehow became legend. It was real, it was messy, and it belonged to everyone. And if the world ended tomorrow, as it sometimes tried to do in the Middle Ages, the villagers would at least have this memory, a day when life felt lighter, when no one had to work. And when two people said yes to each other while the chickens clucked their disapproval nearby. The Greek Symposium, where philosophy met pleasure. In the world of ancient Greece, before the wine poured or the lyre strings hummed, there were rules, so many rules. Though later there would be revelry and riotous laughter, the Greek drinking party, or symposium, was no meaningless free-for-all. It was ritualized, exclusive, and, strangely enough, quite sacred. You couldn't just show up and start guzzling wine. No, that would have been barbarian. First, you had to be invited. The host, known as the symposiarch, carefully curated the guest list. This was an exclusively male event for free men. Slaves only served. Women, only high-class courtesans or hetaira, were permitted inside. Wives stayed home. The evening began with a meal, called the daepanon, where everyone would eat reclining on couches, heads propped on pillows like relaxed philosophers. This wasn't the symposium proper yet. This was just the warm-up. No wine yet. The wine came later. Because once the food was cleared and the floor swept, the real event began. Wine was mixed with water in a great crater, a special mixing bowl. Drinking undiluted wine, as the Scythians did, was considered uncivilized. The symposiarch would decide the ratio of the mix. A weak mix meant you were here for discourse. A strong mix meant you were here for delightful mayhem. It was a very fine line. Too austere, and things got dull. Too drunk, and Plato's dialogues turned into a Dionysian disaster. Every symposium had a purpose, often philosophical, political, or poetic. But underlying it all was a sense of sacred leisure time, which the Greeks called skolola. This wasn't wasted time. This was where ideas were born, where young aristocrats sharpened their minds, played word games, composed impromptu poetry, and perhaps, just perhaps, fell in love. Before the debate began, libations would be offered to Dionysus, the god of wine and divine madness. There was singing, sometimes by hired musicians, sometimes by the guests themselves. A flute girl might play. A hetaira might challenge a guest with a riddle. But everything was structured. Wine was passed clockwise. Each round came with a toast. Drinking too fast was frowned upon. Becoming sloppy was shameful. The ideal guest was witty, charming, and just drunk enough to speak the truth beautifully. Ultimately, the symposium was a performance where men proved their intellectual as well as their alcoholic stamina. It was a dance between reason and revelry. And if you broke the rules, you didn't just embarrass yourself. You insulted the very spirit of the gathering. The physical setting of a symposium was no accident. It was a stage for both the soul and the body to perform. The event usually took place in a specially designed room in Greek homes, called the andron, reserved exclusively for men. It was a square space lined with couches, or klein, each wide enough for one man to recline on his side, propped up on one elbow. The central part was left empty, perfect for servants to pour wine, for dancers to perform, or for impromptu games involving flinging wine dregs at a target. Yes, they had drinking games too. Light came from flickering oil lamps, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense, roasted meat, and occasionally, the perfumes of the hetaira. It was intimate, sensual, and designed to loosen inhibitions without dulling the intellect. The couches were arranged in a circle, encouraging eye contact, verbal sparring, and communal laughter. This wasn't just architecture. This was psychology. Everyone was an equal here. No one sat at the head of the table. No one was above anyone else. This spatial equality fostered philosophical democracy, a moment of leveling in a deeply hierarchical world. The mood could shift dramatically depending on the host and the mix of guests. Some symposiums were political strategy sessions disguised as drinking parties. Others devolved into singing contests and naked dancing. And some, like the one immortalized in Plato's Symposium, were lofty, abstract, and almost religious. But all of them started in the same place, with a shared space, a shared drink, and a shared sense that something significant was about to happen. Even the decorations mattered. Walls were often adorned with mythological paintings, Hercules feasting with the gods, Dionysus leading his drunken revelers, satyrs chasing nymphs. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were reminders of the thin veil between civilization and joyous chaos. They whispered, "This is play, but it is sacred play." And let's not forget the wine cups themselves. Served in ornate cups, or kylikes. These often had erotic or humorous scenes painted on the bottom, gradually revealed as the drinker emptied the cup. The moment of draining the cup was met with laughter, a blush, or a witty comment, depending on who was watching. Central to many a symposium was a dynamic that still puzzles and fascinates modern minds. The pederastic relationship between an older man, the Erasts, and a younger male beloved, the Ereminos. This relationship was not merely tolerated. It was idealized. The older man was the teacher, the lover, the patron of intellect and sophistication. The younger man, often an aristocratic teenager, was the student and the object of admiration, and the symposium was their stage. This relationship was not entirely physical, at least in theory. It was supposed to be about virtue, discipline, and the transmission of knowledge and moral qualities. But that didn't stop the air in the symposium from being thick with erotic tension. Older men would use clever wordplay and recited poetry to woo the beautiful young men reclining beside them. Compliments were expected. Groping was frowned upon. The key was restraint. It demonstrated one's control, dignity, and seriousness of intent. Meanwhile, the beloved was expected to resist, at least publicly. His virtue lay in how artfully he could refuse advances with grace and wit. An easily agreeable boy lost social value. A boy who refused everyone forever risked being seen as cold or arrogant. The ideal was to keep everyone guessing. He blushed. He politely declined. He teased. And above all, he listened. He was expected to absorb not just affection, but wisdom. Not every guest engaged in these dynamics. Married men were supposed to behave, but frankly, many didn't. Courtesans and hetairai were allowed to provide physical pleasure, but the young boys were supposed to offer something higher: inspiration. They were the muses of the male elite. Their youth reminded older men of fleeting beauty, of the cruelty of time, of why philosophy even mattered in the first place. Plato famously used a symposium to explore the nature of love, as a ladder that began with physical attraction and ascended to the contemplation of eternal forms of beauty. But that lofty ascent began quite literally on a couch beside a beautiful boy. The intimacy of the setting made it possible to speak of the soul without shame, to acknowledge desire without fear. Wine was not just a drink at the symposium. It was fuel, a compass, and a test. But the Greeks didn't drink as we do today. For them, drinking undiluted wine was considered a sign of a barbarian. The ideal Greek would dilute his wine with at least 3 parts water. Why? Because the wine was not meant to overwhelm. It was meant to loosen the tongue without dulling the mind. The central crater, a large mixing bowl, sat at the center of the room like an altar. The symposiarch, often elected for the evening, would decide the wine-to-water ratio. He held great power. A strong mix meant a wild night. A weak mix signaled an evening of poetry and discourse. It was a delicate balance, too, and the evening proceeded slowly. Too drunk, and you might vomit on your neighbor's sandals and earn eternal shame. Each guest was given a cup, often beautifully painted, and wine was ladled out in rounds. It flowed clockwise, each man taking a sip before passing it on. But it wasn't just about drinking. It was about rhythm. Each round came with a toast, a song, a witty remark. The wine invited vulnerability, creativity, and occasionally, madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, the god of wine, could inspire both divine insight and complete lunacy, depending on how much you poured, and they poured, but not without purpose. There was an art to pacing oneself. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, exchange clever barbs, recite Homeric verse, and still sit upright. Losing control? That was for barbarians. In fact, the symposium was in part a training ground to demonstrate that a true man could enjoy pleasure and still be self-controlled. Self-mastery, even in inebriation, was a virtue. Not all guests adhered to the ideal, however. The drunkard who danced naked, knocked over the lyre player, or mistook a slave boy for a satyr would become the subject of ridicule for years. Tales of symposium disasters were passed down as cautionary stories. But on the other hand, the slightly inebriated philosopher who spoke divinely on the nature of justice or love could be remembered forever. Not every moment at a symposium was philosophical rumination. As the wine flowed and minds loosened, the Greeks turned to games and music, structured, deliberate pastimes that revealed a man's spirit, intelligence, and social finesse. The symposium was not just a place to display intellect. It was a playground for performance. One of the most popular games was katabos, a strange and surprisingly elegant pastime. Guests would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, usually a disc perched on a stand or floating in a bowl of water, trying to dislodge it with a precise shot. Success wasn't just about skill. It was symbolic. Men often called out the names of their beloved as they flung their wine. A bold blend of flirtation and physical prowess. Hit the target. The gods approved of your passion. Mississippi. Well, perhaps you weren't worthy of her or him. Music was always present. A hired flute girl, or electric, might play haunting melodies to accompany a toast or dance between courses. Sometimes she danced herself, swaying to the rhythm with the rising heat of the evening. But guests didn't just listen. They performed. Reciting Homer, improvising erotic poetry, or singing drinking songs were not optional. It was expected. A man who couldn't carry a tune or couldn't deliver a clever verse would be silently judged, even scorned. But the real performance was verbal. Witty repartee, or symposium talk, was an art form. Verbal duels tested memory, wordplay, philosophical knowledge, and grace. Men would pose riddles, challenge each other to impromptu poetry, or tell sharp jokes. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about finesse. The best conversationalist was quick-witted, profound, and subtly provocative. And then there were the riddles. Sometimes philosophical, sometimes bawdy. A well-timed riddle could silence the room or erupt it in laughter. The most admired guests could deliver a vulgar pun and a theory of justice in the same breath. And if the space was right, if the wine was balanced and the company sharp, the entire event would take on an almost magical atmosphere. Half performance, half discovery. The goal of it all was not just to impress. It was to connect, to forge bonds, to let personality, intellect, and desire intertwine. In this joyous chaos, reputations were made or shattered. Because in the Greek Symposium, you weren't just judged by what you thought, but by how artfully you said it while half drunk and draped in a tunic. While Greek wives stayed behind closed doors, forbidden from the intellectual and sensual world of the symposium, another type of woman moved freely through the flickering lamps, hetairai. These high-class courtesans were not simply entertainers or prostitutes. They were educated, witty, and trained in music, conversation, and seduction. They weren't just present at the symposium. They were essential to it. A hetairai could recite poetry, sing along to the lyre, debate philosophical ideas, and even outwit the cleverest aristocrats. Unlike most Greek women, they were not confined to the home. They could own property, attend parties, and even accumulate wealth. Some became legendary, like Aspasia, the renowned companion of Pericles, who was rumored to have taught rhetoric to Athens' greatest minds. But make no mistake, their position was complex. They walked a thin line between being praised and reviled. Revered for their intellect and charm, they were also objects of desire and satire. Still, in the wine-soaked world of the symposium, a hetairai was often the only woman who could speak freely and be heard. Their presence changed the dynamic. With them, the evening was no longer just a male club of philosophy and flirtation. It became a tense, unpredictable dance of power and performance. A well-placed comment from a hetairai could deflate a man's ego or spark a debate that lasted all night. They were conversational warriors trained to challenge, tease, and occasionally humiliate. The eroticism was always in the air, but it wasn't always consummated. The flirtation, the tension, that was the point. Some hetairai were mistresses. Others kept their distance, using their allure as leverage. They played by their own rules, often using their beauty and wit to gain social advancement or to manipulate political alliances. For many men, these women represented a dream. Female companionship without domestic obligations, sensuality without subservience, intellect without constraint. They were free in a way Greek wives could never be, and that made them both captivating and dangerous. In a room designed for male pleasure, hetairai were a reminder that true control was never entirely in male hands. They could derail a joke, redirect a debate, or inspire a poem that would be remembered for generations. In a culture obsessed with power and performance, they were masters of both. Though the symposium had its share of games, flirtation, and poetic excess, its greatest legacy is arguably its intellect. Beneath the laughter and increasing inebriation, something remarkable happened. Serious thinking took root. These weren't just mere drinking parties. They were laboratories of the mind. Somewhere between the third cup of wine and the final riddle, the guests often plunged into debates that would shape Western philosophy forever. The most famous example, of course, is Plato's Symposium, a fictionalized account of a real gathering where Socrates, Alcibiades, Aristophanes, and others explored the nature of love. But this wasn't an isolated event. Across Greece, particularly in Athens, the symposium became known as the place where ideas clashed. Public affairs, metaphysics, ethics, and human desire were all on the menu. These debates weren't lectures. They were battles of logic, of wit, of emotional conviction. The setting mattered. Wine lowered defenses. Humor softened blows. And the intimate space allowed for vulnerability. You could challenge a man's view of justice, his belief in the gods, or even his sexual preferences, and if you were clever enough, you would earn his respect. One of the central themes was eros, erotic love, not just in the carnal sense, but as a philosophical force. Socrates, through Plato, described love as a ladder. It began with physical attraction, ascended through the appreciation of beauty, and culminated in the contemplation of the eternal form of beauty itself. That idea, it was born at a symposium. But other topics were aired. What is virtue? What makes a wise man? Can the soul be immortal? Is pleasure a good in itself or merely a distraction? These were not academic questions. They were urgent, personal, and aired between sips of pungent wine. It's no accident that so many great Greek thinkers, Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, were regular attendees of symposiums. These events were the incubators of thought. They offered a rare combination: entertainment, intellect, sensuality, and challenge. And unlike public forums, the symposium allowed for nuance. You could speak freely, revise your opinion mid-sentence, or offer a half-formed idea and see where it landed. For all its intellectual ambition and poetic charm, the symposium could, and often did, descend into chaos. While philosophers dreamed of truth and beauty, reality had a habit of barging in, reeking of wine and staggering. The symposium's tightrope walk between order and revelry didn't always end well. And when it failed spectacularly. Take Alcibiades, the handsome, brilliant, and notoriously flamboyant Athenian statesman. He famously burst into the symposium in Plato's dialogue, already drunk, crowned with ivy like Dionysus himself. Instead of delivering a sober rumination on love, he gave a wild, personal, and erotic encomium on Socrates. It was funny, moving, and almost inappropriate. The line between admiration and desire blurred, and what was supposed to be a lofty evening turned into an uncontrolled outpouring of drunken obsession. But Alcibiades' antics weren't just awkward. They were prophetic. He would later betray Athens, defect to Sparta, switch sides again, and die in exile. His love of wine, performance, and recklessness mirrored the darker side of symposium culture. Charm without restraint, intelligence without ethics. And he wasn't alone. Many a political scandal began at a symposium. Rumors spread like wildfire. Who had flirted too boldly? Who had gotten too drunk? Who had insulted a guest or blasphemed a god in a drunken stupor? It was all noted, whispered, and weaponized. A small mistake at a private symposium could ruin a public career. The symposium also became associated with decadence, particularly in later periods. As Athens declined and Rome rose, the original balance between intellect and pleasure tilted dangerously towards pure hedonism. Wine was no longer diluted. Guests competed for gluttony instead of poetry. Flute girls outnumbered philosophers, and what had once been sacred play became a cynical display. Even the Spartans, known for their austere lifestyle, scorned Athenian symposiums as soft, effeminate, and decadent. To them, the idea of reclining on couches, debating love while sipping diluted wine, seemed like a recipe for moral decay. And in a way, they were right. Yet, the Greeks were aware of the risks. That's why moderation was so prized. A man who could maintain his dignity while drunk, charm without seducing, and debate without humiliating, was the true hero of the symposium. Long after the last crater was emptied and the final lyre note faded, the Greek Symposium left behind something far more enduring than a hangover, an intellectual and cultural legacy that still shapes how we think, talk, and connect today. What began as a structured drinking party became one of the most unlikely engines of philosophy, art, and social development in history. The symposium posited a radical idea, especially for its time, that leisure time was not merely idleness. It was sacred space. Skolola, the Greek word for leisure, is the root of our word school. That's not a coincidence. The symposium turned leisure into a crucible for learning. It proved that wisdom didn't have to come from temples or lecture halls. It could emerge amidst wine, laughter, flirtation, and debate under flickering lamplight. Plato's Symposium is the most famous relic of this world, and its impact is hard to overstate. It gave us not only a model for structured philosophical dialogue, but also enduring concepts like Platonic love, the ladder of Eros, and the idea that beauty and truth are intimately connected. The format of that work, men reclining, drinking, and improvising on a common theme, would become the archetype for everything from university seminars to late-night salons. The Romans inherited the symposium and transformed it into the convivium, a more lavish, less philosophical affair. But the structure remained. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers reawakened the spirit of the symposium in their own salons, circles, and societies. And even today, we carry its echoes. The dinner party that devolves into a deep conversation at midnight. The book club that spends more time on existential questions than the actual book. The podcast where two minds drink, laugh, and dissect reality. Even the symposium's flaws left their mark. Its gender exclusivity, its hierarchy of beauty and age, its danger of excess, all remain relevant as cautionary tales for how communities are built and broken. But perhaps its greatest gift was the idea that pleasure and thinking don't have to be opposites, that beauty, desire, humor, and intellect can all share a single room, that truth can be seductive, not just reasoned. In the end, the Greek Symposium wasn't just where philosophy met pleasure. It was where civilization discovered that the mind, body, and spirit all needed a place to play. And in that wine-soaked sacred space, the Western world learned to talk. Ancient Egyptian beauty culture, a language of status, spirituality, and hygiene. Imagine strolling through the streets of ancient Thebes or Memphis. The heat rises in shimmering waves from the limestone, and the air is thick with the scent of frankincense, lotus blossoms, and palm wine. But it's not the temples or soaring obelisks that capture your attention. It's the people, men and women alike. Their faces are adorned with thick, dark lines of kohl, drawn dramatically from the corners of their eyes. Their heads are crowned with elaborate wigs, braided, curled, sometimes even perfumed. It's a striking, unmistakable, and utterly pervasive image. In ancient Egypt, personal appearance wasn't mere vanity. It was a coded language. What you wore on your head and around your eyes told the world who you were, what you believed, and where you stood in society. Wigs and kohl weren't simply trends. They were declarations of identity, spirituality, and hygiene. The eye makeup was made from either a deep green powder called malachite or the more common kohl from galena, a black lead sulfide, applied with precise artistry. This look was bold, but not just for beauty. It was believed to protect the eyes from the harsh sun, much like modern athletes use eye black. More importantly, it held deep spiritual and medicinal significance. Ancient Egyptians believed the pigment guarded against evil spirits and infections, particularly from the flies and bacteria ever present around the Nile. This wasn't just superstition. Modern science has confirmed that lead-based kohl can have antibacterial properties. So, yes, your eyeliner could literally save your life. Both men and women, rich and poor, lined their eyes with bold black strokes, extending the pigment out towards the temples in elegant curves. And they did it not because it looked cool, though it very much did. They did it because the eyes were sacred. The ancient word for eye makeup was med, and its application was an almost ritualistic act. The most common formulation was made from galena, a dark gray mineral ground into a fine powder and mixed with oil or animal fat. Applied with a stick, it created the iconic black line that defined the Egyptian face for centuries. But it was more than aesthetics. Galena was believed to ward off disease and misfortune. It wasn't just paint. It was magic. Why the obsession with the eyes? Because in Egyptian mythology, the eye had power. The eye of Horus, one of the oldest symbols of protection and royal power, represented healing and wholeness. Applying kohl was to invoke this protective emblem, to shield oneself from harm, both spiritual and physical. And protection was no small matter in the ancient world. The Nile, while life-giving, also brought disease and pests, flies, dust, bacteria. These were daily concerns. Kohl could act as an early form of sunscreen and an antibacterial barrier. Archaeologists have even discovered that the lead salts in kohl stimulate the production of nitric oxide in the skin, which helps the immune system. So, in a very real sense, it healed while it adorned. But the application of kohl wasn't uniform for everyone. The wealthy had access to finely ground galena and ornate applicators made of ivory or polished wood. Poorer citizens might use simpler versions or crushed charcoal. But the impulse to adorn and protect the eyes transcended social strata. Even laborers could be found with lined eyes, their own daily sacred ritual. Interestingly, the act of applying eye makeup was profoundly sensual, not just in the modern cosmetic sense. It was intimate. To prepare your eyes for the world was to prepare your soul. It was a connection to the divine, to hygiene, and to the erotic, all traced along the lash line. In ancient Egypt, your hair, or more accurately your wig, told everyone everything they needed to know about you. Who you were, how clean you were, how wealthy you were, how close you were to the gods. Wigs were not mere vanity. They were status, practicality, and ritual, all woven into a single elegant headpiece. Let's start with the basics. Most Egyptians shaved their heads. The reasons were practical and cultural. In the blistering Egyptian heat, real hair was hot, prone to sweat, and a magnet for lice. Shaving it off was cleaner, cooler, and far more comfortable. But walking around with a bald head wasn't exactly elegant. So, enter the wig. Wigs were primarily worn by the elite, the pharaohs, priests, and wealthy nobles. But even middle-class citizens owned simpler versions. They were made from a variety of materials depending on your social standing. The wealthiest Egyptians commissioned wigs from human hair, sometimes mixed with vegetable fibers or sheep's wool for added volume and structure. These wigs could be styled with elaborate curls, tight braids, or layered tresses, often held in place with beeswax and fragrant cones of perfumed fat that slowly melted into the scalp as the day wore on. In short, it was luxury. The shape and style were also statements. A short, geometric bob might denote a formal occasion, while long, flowing curls with gold beads signified royal power. High-ranking priests often wore specific styles related to their temple duties, and children, even royal ones, were sometimes depicted with a distinctive side lock of youth, typically shaved except for one elaborately braided tress. But wigs were more than an aesthetic shield. They were deeply symbolic. Covering the head was to denote control, purity, and divine harmony. Priests shaved themselves completely before entering temples, but would wear wigs when performing outside rituals, highlighting the distinction between spiritual sanctity and public presentation. Over time, wigs became family heirlooms, passed down or buried with their owners. A fine wig might be carefully placed in a tomb, its strands still holding their shape thousands of years later. Some mummies have even been found with their wigs still in place. Intricately braided tresses and tightly wound curls resting on a silent face, ready for the afterlife. If the wig was the crown, the scent cone was the aura. No ancient Egyptian look was complete without fragrance, worn quite literally on your head. Those peculiar lumps we see in Egyptian art, perched atop elaborate wigs, weren't just artistic flourishes. They were scent cones, solid mixtures of oils, fats, and aromatics meant to slowly melt and bathe the wearer in divine fragrance. The scent cones were made from a base of animal fat or beeswax infused with myrrh, frankincense, lotus blossoms, or cinnamon. As the day wore on and the desert sun beat down, the cones would soften, slowly releasing their perfumes. This wasn't just for personal pleasure. It was a statement. I am clean. I am sacred. I smell like the gods. Fragrance in Egypt wasn't a luxury. It was a moral imperative. Cleanliness was next to godliness, literally. The gods themselves were believed to smell sweet, and temples burned incense daily to invite them in. To walk through a city smelling of lotus or frankincense was not merely attractive. It was spiritually resonant. A fragrant person was a civilized person, one who was in harmony with Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic balance and order. Scent cones weren't just for special occasions. While the Egyptian elite wore them to feasts and ceremonies, the daily act of anointing the body with oils and perfumes was a common practice across all social strata. Laborers, after a day's work in the sun, would cleanse and anoint themselves. It was part of being human and part of being worthy. Wigs, too, were often perfumed on their own. Some were preserved with fragrant leaves or herbs braided directly into the fibers. Others were refreshed with oils gently rubbed into the strands. A wealthy Egyptian's hair wasn't just beautiful. It smelled divine, and that scent signaled everything: status, piety, and sexual allure. Interestingly, this attention to fragrance also had practical benefits. The melting scent cones acted as a moisturizer in Egypt's arid climate, protecting hair and scalp. They could even repel insects. Once again, beauty and function went hand in hand. One of the most striking features of ancient Egyptian beauty culture was its gender-neutral approach to cosmetics. In a world where modern standards often relegate makeup and beautification solely to women, ancient Egypt blurred the lines. Men wore kohl. Women shaved their heads. Everyone oiled their skin, perfumed their bodies, and donned elaborate wigs for special occasions. Beauty was not gendered. It was sacred, hygienic, and deeply social. A high-status Egyptian man might begin his day with a full-body wash, followed by the application of fragrant oils. Then came the kohl. Yes, thick black eyeliner expertly applied to both upper and lower lids. The eyes were elongated outwards with the iconic line we still associate with pharaohs and deities. It wasn't vanity, it was identity. Women followed a similar ritual, though perhaps more elaborate in their hairstyling and use of scent. The beauty standard for elite women was high: pale skin, intricate wigs, lips stained with red ochre or carmine, and large, emphasized eyes. But here's the difference. These practices were not about competing with other women or impressing men. They were about aligning oneself with the divine. After all, the gods themselves were depicted in full regalia, magnificently made up, beautiful, radiant. Androgyny, in fact, played a powerful symbolic role in Egyptian iconography. Deities routinely blurred gender lines. Hathor, the goddess of beauty and fertility, was both maternal and sensual. Osiris, ruler of the underworld, was depicted with green skin, a false beard, and makeup, hardly hypermasculine. Even pharaohs like Akhenaten were portrayed with oddly genderless features: soft stomachs, almond eyes, wide hips. This cultural acceptance of cross-gender beautification created a society where appearance was not just tolerated, but expected. A man who didn't wear kohl or keep himself fragrant might be seen as lazy, uncivilized, or even impious. Personal grooming was not an indulgence. It was a duty. Even servants and laborers participated in this ritual, albeit with simpler materials. They might use soot instead of galena, vegetable oils instead of expensive perfumes, linen wigs instead of human hair. But the intent was the same: to present oneself as complete, clean, and worthy of respect. In ancient Egypt, cleanliness was next to godliness. Dirt was not just unsightly, it was unholy, and personal hygiene was a form of spiritual discipline. That's why wigs, kohl, Perfumes and cosmetics weren't mere accessories of wealth or vanity. They were physical proof of your class, your discipline, and your worthiness to participate in society. Let's start with the basics. Hair. Shaving the head and body was common for both men and women. Hair retained sweat and lice, enemies in a desert climate. A shaved scalp symbolized order, self-control, and ritual purity. This is why priests serving in temples were required to be completely bald and to bathe several times a day. Their ritual duties demanded not just piety, but visible purity. Wigs then became both a practical and symbolic solution, offering style while allowing the wearer to remain ritually clean underneath. Bathing was a daily routine for anyone who could afford the time and water. The wealthier you were, the more elaborate your hygiene routine. Affluent households had pedestal basins and servants who poured scented water with lotus or rose petals over your body. You would scrub with natron, a natural mineral salt that acted as soap, and then apply liberal amounts of oil to keep the skin supple. Your fragrance also told others how much you were worth. A cheap oil made from castor or morena might get you through the day, but frankincense, cinnamon, or lotus oil, those marked you as a person of standing. To be clean and fragrant was respectable. To be dirty or malodorous was not just a personal failing. It was a social scandal. And what about your eyes? The quality of your coal, its fineness, the minerals it used, and how artfully it was applied was another clear sign of class. Sloppy lines or cheap materials would instantly betray you. A noble's coal jar might be made of ivory or alabaster. A laborer's might be roughly carved from clay or wood. Clothing also reinforced these hygienic signals. Light, white linen was preferred. It was clean, breathable, and symbolized purity. Stains or unwashed garments suggested laziness or low status. In ancient Egypt, beauty wasn't just for the living. It followed you into the afterlife. The very same kohl, wigs, and perfumes that signaled cleanliness, class, and piety in daily life were carefully placed in tombs to accompany the deceased. Death for the Egyptians was not an end. It was a transition, and you were expected to look your best when meeting the gods. Tomb paintings and grave goods reveal the profound extent to which beautification rituals were linked to funerary practices. Elite mummies were interred with cosmetic jars, coal pots, wig boxes, mirrors, unguent oils, and even combs and razors. In some cases, the deceased were depicted on the sarcophagus itself with elaborately painted eyes and perfectly styled hair, often wearing a ceremonial wig adorned with gold or lapis lazuli. The message was clear: the soul should arrive in the next world clean, presentable, and divine. The priests who prepared the body performed rituals that included the application of cosmetics. They lined the eyes with black, re-oiled the skin, and sometimes even donned wigs on the deceased before wrapping the body in linen. The purpose was twofold: to preserve the body and to elevate the spirit. Beauty here wasn't just ceremonial. It was transformative. The opening of the mouth ceremony, one of the most crucial rites for the dead, symbolized the restoration of the senses, sight, smell, speech, to the departed soul. The beautifully lined eyes of the deceased were not just symbolic. They were believed to be able to see again in the afterlife. The scent cones and sacred oils helped the soul smell the sweet air of paradise, and polished mirrors ensured the dead could admire their own perfect form for eternity. Even the gods of death and protection were depicted as beautiful. Anubis, the jackal-headed embalmer, appeared with darkly lined eyes and idealized, sleek features. Isis and Nephthys, guardians of the dead, were always shown with perfect hair and divine makeup, serving as role models for both the living and the soon-to-be dead. For the Egyptians, to be carefully groomed in death was to show respect for the gods and to signal readiness for rebirth. Decomposition, bad smells, unkempt appearances. These were not just physical failings. They were spiritual failures. Beneath the elegance of ancient Egyptian beauty rituals lay a world of practical, exquisitely crafted tools, both ceremonial and surprisingly intricate. If you were an elite Egyptian preparing for a feast, a temple ceremony, or your own funeral, you didn't just smear kohl with your finger or blindly run a comb through your hair. You had a personal beauty kit, often as elaborately crafted and symbolic as any religious artifact. Let's start with mirrors. Made of polished bronze or copper, these handheld discs gleamed enough to reflect a clear face, at least for those who could afford them. These mirrors often featured elaborate handles carved from wood, ivory, or faience, and were shaped like deities, lotus stalks, or protective goddesses. Looking into a mirror wasn't just about vanity. It was a reminder of order, symmetry, and divine harmony. The kohl applicator was another essential. These weren't flimsy brushes, but thin sticks, sometimes carved from bone, ivory, or metal, designed to dip into the stone or pottery jars holding the galena or malachite powder. The act of lining the eyes with these tools was often meditative, precise, and done with great care. Some of these applicators were so cherished they were buried with their owners. Wig combs were flat, broad, and made of carved wood or ivory, designed to gently untangle the intricate braids and curls of elaborate wigs. Wealthier individuals had full grooming kits that included razors for shaving, tweezers for plucking stray hairs, and even unguent jars designed to hold various scented oils. Some high-status women even had servants whose sole job was wig maintenance and the blending of personalized perfumes. Cosmetic palettes, the stone slabs used to grind and mix pigments, were part of almost every household. Even children's tombs sometimes contained small palettes, indicating how early beauty rituals began. The famous Narmer palette, one of the earliest archaeological finds from Egypt, shows cosmetic tools present at the very dawn of Egyptian civilization, blending politics, ritual, and aesthetics into a single stone slab. These tools weren't hidden away in drawers. They were proudly displayed, often adorned with animal motifs or inscribed with protective spells. They served as a reminder that beauty was not separate from life. It was at its very center. You weren't just painting a face. You were participating in a sacred art form using tools blessed by centuries of tradition. Thousands of years have passed since the last pharaoh lined his eyes with kohl or a noblewoman set a scent cone atop her wig. Yet, the visual language of ancient Egyptian beauty continues to ripple through history, echoing in everything from high fashion to modern makeup tutorials. What began as a sacred ritual and social necessity along the Nile now lives on in runways, cosmetics, and the cultural imagination. Let's start with eyeliner. The bold, elongated line from the corner of the eye, that unmistakable cat-eye look, comes straight from Egypt. Cleopatra didn't invent the look, but she certainly perfected it. And her image, widely disseminated in art and cinema, turned Egyptian kohl into a global symbol of allure, mystery, and power. Today's eyeliner trends, whether haute couture or everyday style, still pursue the same elongated, dramatic shape born in the temples of Hathor and the tombs of queens. Wigs, too, have endured. Ancient Egyptians saw them as more than mere fashion. They were statements of hygiene, status, and control. Today, they represent transformation, identity, and even empowerment. Proudly worn by celebrities, cancer survivors, and cultural artists. In many ways, modern wigs carry the same message. I choose how I present myself to the world. And let's not forget skincare. The Egyptians were early masters of moisturizing, exfoliating, and perfuming the body. They used oils, salts, and clays not just for function, but as an expression of spirituality and discipline. Today's multi-step skincare routines have their DNA traced directly back to the unguent jars of Thebes. Even in pop culture, ancient Egyptian beauty refuses to die. Films, music videos, fashion shows, and cosmetic brands constantly tap into the visual power of Nefertiti's cheekbones or Tutankhamun's striking mask. These aren't just royals. They are icons. Their beauty standards, once rooted in sacred belief, have become shorthand for elegance and mystique. But the most enduring thing is the idea that beauty was never just about looking good. For the Egyptians, it was health, it was holiness, it was identity, and it was social structure. All painted in black kohl and sculpted in undulating wigs. And in a world still grappling with image, self-expression, and ritual, their message remains timeless. Beauty is power. Beauty is protection. Beauty is purpose. And from the temples of Karnak to today's vanity tables, that truth still lies in our eyes. Jamestown, the tumultuous birth of an empire. Imagine witnessing the fading days of 1606 as three small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, slipped from the foggy shores of England under the flag of the Virginia Company. A private joint stock enterprise, The Virginia Company didn't embark on this voyage for benevolence or the glory of the crown. It was a business venture fueled by dreams of gold, silk, spices, and, above all, profit. What they got instead was mud, disease, starvation, and a tiny, precarious outpost that would become the seed of British America. The men on these ships were a curious mix. There were seasoned sailors and laborers, but also a significant number of gentlemen, men with swords and titles, but no farming experience. Most had no idea how to build a colony. Few had ever done hard physical labor in their lives. Their expectations were wildly out of sync with the reality awaiting them across the Atlantic. After more than 4 months at sea, including a stop in the Canary Islands and a storm-ravaged trip through the Caribbean, the expedition finally arrived in what would become known as Virginia. On May 14, 1607, the settlers chose a marshy, uninhabited peninsula along the James River for their settlement. They named it Jamestown in honor of King James I. From a defensive standpoint, the location seemed ideal. It was far enough inland to avoid detection by the Spanish Navy and surrounded by water on 3 sides, offering protection from potential native attacks. But this position came at a cost. The water was brackish, undrinkable, mosquitoes swarmed, and the land was of poor quality. In most practical senses, it was a death trap. Nevertheless, they unloaded their supplies and began building a wooden fort. The settlers had little idea what awaited them. Brutal summers, freezing winters, and a flimsy supply line stretching across an ocean. Within weeks, disease began to spread. The water made them sick. Food was scarce, leadership was weak, and arguments were constant. Yet, on that mosquito-ridden, miserable patch of ground, they laid the first stones of something that would eventually grow into an empire. The gamble was immense. The stakes were impossibly high, but the dream of empire, wealth, and glory pushed them forward, blind to the catastrophe that had already begun to unfold. Jamestown was founded, but its survival? That was another matter entirely. From the moment the settlers stepped foot on Jamestown's soil, death began its slow, relentless march. The land was lush with promise, but in reality, it proved to be devastating. The water was brackish, too salty to drink safely, and too contaminated to sustain life. Crops wouldn't grow in the sandy, marshy soil, and the men, largely unaccustomed to hard labor, were unprepared to farm, fish, or hunt effectively. Within weeks, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria began to spread. Food supplies ran out almost immediately. The initial provisions brought across the Atlantic were never meant to last the year. The settlers had counted on regular resupply ships and perhaps some quick local foraging. Neither materialized. Most of the colonists were gentlemen or craftsmen, not farmers. They lacked the know-how to cultivate crops in a new climate, and too many refused manual labor altogether, deeming it beneath their station. The summer of 1607 was brutally hot. Disease decimated the population. Insects were everywhere. Drinking from the river only made their condition worse. As the hunger grew more desperate, the settlers resorted to increasingly grim measures. They boiled leather for broth. They dug for roots, acorns, and even snakes and rats. By winter, grimly known as the starving time, the situation became horrific. That winter, the colony was besieged, not by Native Americans, but by nature and their own hubris. With Captain John Smith wounded and gone, and tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy escalating, trade had ceased. The settlers were literally trapped behind the fort's wooden walls, surrounded by hostile woods and freezing temperatures. Witnesses reported unimaginable acts. Settlers resorted to cannibalism, exhuming bodies and boiling human flesh to survive. George Percy, one of the colony's leaders, later wrote that they were driven to such great straits of hunger that they were forced to eat things which nature most abhorred. Of the roughly 500 colonists alive in the fall of 1609, only about 60 survived to see spring. If Jamestown had a turning point in its initial chaos, it arrived in the form of a man, Captain John Smith, a soldier, an adventurer, and, as he liked to remind everyone, a survivor of many battles. Smith was no aristocrat. He didn't wear a powdered wig or carry a fancy title. But what he lacked in social standing, he made up for in resilience, audacity, and hard-won experience. Precisely what the struggling colony needed. In the autumn of 1608, With the death toll rising and morale near collapse, Smith seized command. He didn't ask politely. He took control. The gentlemen who had refused to work found themselves facing his famous policy: "He that will not work shall not eat." It wasn't a metaphor. Smith enforced labor, dividing the settlers into work gangs to build, farm, and secure firewood. No one was exempt, not even the gentlemen. Starvation didn't respect social status. Smith also recognized the necessity of forging relationships with the surrounding Powhatan tribes. Where others had treated the native people with suspicion or hostility, Smith brought diplomacy backed by force. He traded copper pots and beads for corn and grain, using gifts, threats, and strategic displays of power to secure provisions. These exchanges were not always peaceful, but they were often effective. At a time when starvation haunted every meal, Smith's ability to secure supplies kept the colony from utter collapse. He mapped the Chesapeake Bay with military precision, drawing the first accurate charts of the region. These charts would prove invaluable for later settlers. His explorations also revealed how little the English knew about the land they claimed. They were not in an empty void. They were surrounded by powerful native societies, organized and vastly outnumbering them. Despite his success, Smith was not well liked. He was brash, self-serving, and quick to insult his enemies, which, in Jamestown, was almost everyone. In 1609, a gunpowder explosion severely wounded him. Whether it was sabotage or accident remains unclear, but the result was definite. Smith was shipped back to England. Without his leadership, Jamestown once again plunged into disarray. But the foundation he laid, discipline, diplomacy, and sheer survival, had left its mark. Captain John Smith didn't build a utopia. He created an opportunity. And in the Virginia wilderness, that was more than most could have done. Long before the English set sail, the land they landed on was already governed. It wasn't empty wilderness, but the heartland of a vast and powerful Native American empire, the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Wahunsenkaw, whom the English simply called Chief Powhatan. This confederacy of over 30 tribes controlled the entire Chesapeake region. They had established villages, cultivated fields, trading networks, and a complex political system. The English were not pioneers. They were intruders. Initially, Chief Powhatan saw an opportunity. The newcomers brought metal tools, beads, mirrors, and weapons, items the Powhatan valued. A limited relationship could be useful, especially if the English remained small and dependent. At first, food and trade were exchanged. Diplomacy, though strained, held, but it was always fragile. Into this tense atmosphere emerged a figure who would become a symbol of peace efforts: Pocahontas. The daughter of Chief Powhatan, likely around 10 or 11 years old at the time, she was not a princess in the European sense, but she held significant political sway. According to John Smith, she famously saved his life from execution in 1607, though modern scholars debate whether this story was exaggerated, misunderstood, or outright fabricated. Regardless, Pocahontas became a regular figure in English accounts, often acting as a messenger or intermediary between the two cultures. But the truce couldn't last. As Jamestown grew, so did English demands for food, land, and dominance. The settlers plundered villages when trade failed. Powhatan warriors retaliated. Trust eroded rapidly. The English saw land as something to possess, the Powhatan as something to live with. This clash of worldviews made peaceful coexistence almost impossible. By 1609, the relationship had completely broken down. The Powhatan Confederacy began a campaign of siege, cutting off Jamestown from food and water during the brutal starving time. Any settler found outside the fort was ambushed and killed. Inside, the colonists starved or died of disease. It was a struggle for power, and Powhatan was sending a message: this land was not for the taking. The English, weakened but defiant, refused to abandon the colony. They believed God and empire were on their side. The Powhatan believed they were defending their home. The battle for Virginia was not just about land. It was about survival, sovereignty, and the refusal to yield. Few names in early American history have been as romanticized or as misunderstood as Pocahontas. For centuries, her story has been twisted into myth. A native princess who saved a white Englishman, bridging two cultures with a single act of love. The truth is far more complex and far more tragic. Pocahontas, whose given name was Matoka, was the daughter of Chief Powhatan and likely no older than 11 or 12 when the English first arrived. Her relationship with the settlers began early, primarily through her connection to John Smith. Whether or not she literally saved Smith's life, as he later claimed, she became a symbol of communication between the Powhatan people and Jamestown. She carried messages, helped arrange food exchanges, and occasionally appeared at the settlement, though not as a quaint curiosity, but as a political figure in her own right. As tensions escalated and diplomacy collapsed, Pocahontas disappeared from English records for several years. Then, in 1613, everything changed. In one of many skirmishes between the settlers and native tribes, Pocahontas was captured by the English and held as a bargaining chip. Her captors demanded her father return English prisoners and stolen weapons. Chief Powhatan procrastinated. Pocahontas remained imprisoned. During her captivity, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and was baptized as Rebecca. Some say she did so willingly. Others argue it was a coerced conversion. Either way, this transformation made her an ideal tool for colonial propaganda. She married John Rolfe, a tobacco planter, in 1614. Their marriage temporarily helped secure peace between the English and the Powhatan in what became known as the Peace of Pocahontas. But this was no fairy tale. Pocahontas never returned to live among her people. In 1616, she was brought to England as a living advertisement for the success of the Jamestown experiment. She was paraded before nobles and King James himself, dressed in English clothes, speaking their tongue. Her identity had been overwritten by colonial ambition. In 1617, while preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas died suddenly, likely from disease. She was around 21 years old. Her death ended any illusion that harmony between the English and Powhatan could be sustained. Pocahontas lived between two worlds, never truly belonging to either. To the English, she was a symbol of conquest and assimilation. To her own people, perhaps a tragic reminder of what was being lost. By 1610, Jamestown had survived starvation, disease, leadership collapses, and war, but just barely. The colony still lacked what the Virginia Company wanted most: profit. There was no gold, no silk, and no spices. Investors back in London were growing restless. Colonization was expensive, and Jamestown was beginning to look like a costly failure. The settlers needed a cash crop, something the English market would crave. And they found it in a leafy, bitter plant: tobacco. John Rolfe, a young widower and ambitious planter, brought a strain of tobacco seeds from the Caribbean, specifically Nicotiana tabacum. Unlike the coarser native varieties used by the Powhatan, this imported tobacco was smoother, milder, and far more addictive. English consumers couldn't get enough of it. By 1612, Rolfe had successfully cultivated his first crop. In just a few years, tobacco transformed Jamestown from a starving outpost into a booming economic enterprise. The tobacco plant thrived in the warm, humid Virginia climate. Tobacco fields began to spread out from the fortified town, turning what had once been hostile land into agricultural gold. The English had found their reason to stay. But tobacco came at a cost. The crop quickly depleted soil nutrients, requiring ever more land to maintain yields. That meant encroaching on native territory, further escalating tensions with the Powhatan. The drive for profit clashed directly with native survival. Labor was another issue. Tobacco was incredibly labor-intensive. Initially, the English relied on indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked for several years in exchange for passage to the New World. But even this wasn't enough. Within a few decades, Jamestown would begin importing enslaved Africans to meet the demand, laying the groundwork for a brutal system of slavery that would shape American history for centuries. Still, tobacco breathed life into the colony. Exports skyrocketed. New settlers arrived. Land grants expanded. Jamestown was no longer just an imperial experiment. It was a functioning, profitable settlement. It wasn't the future the Virginia Company had initially envisioned. They had dreamed of finding gold mines and building cities. What they got was a muddy patch of land and fields full of tobacco. But it worked. And for England, that was enough. Tobacco didn't just save Jamestown. It cemented the future of the American colonies to the land, to labor, and to a deadly kind of success. In August 1619, a ship anchored near Point Comfort, not far from Jamestown. On board were some 20-odd enslaved African men and women, seized by Portuguese traders, pilfered by English privateers, and now sold to the English settlers. Their arrival marked a moment both unnoticed and momentous. It was the first recorded instance of Africans being brought to British North America. The ship, the White Lion, had captured these individuals from a Portuguese slave ship bound for Spanish colonies. Upon reaching Virginia, these Africans were exchanged for food and supplies. Official records describe them as 20 and odd Negroes, and their exact legal status remains debated by historians. Were they slaves in the full sense, or were they treated as indentured servants, expected to earn their freedom over time? The truth is complex and ominous. Early records suggest some Africans like Anthony and Isabella did gain their freedom and even own property. But as tobacco profits soared and the demand for labor escalated, the lines between indentured servitude and racial slavery began to harden. What began ambiguously would in a few decades evolve into a system of chattel slavery based on race. Initially, these Africans entered a colony that was already reliant on forced labor. The tobacco fields needed more workers than the English could supply. European indentured servants were dying off from disease or fleeing into the frontier. The colonial economy was ravenous, and African labor, seen as more resilient and less costly in the long run, offered a solution. The 1619 event is often seen as a foundational moment in American history, not just for Jamestown, but for the nation that would emerge centuries later. It marked the beginning of a racial caste system that would shape laws, economics, and identity for generations. Yet, at the time, it likely unfolded without fanfare. No speeches were given, no outrage recorded, no sense of a historical turning point, just another transaction in a colony built on survival and profit. But its legacy was profound. Those first Africans, stripped of their homelands, families, and freedom, took root in Virginia soil. From their suffering and resilience would spring a long, painful chapter in American history. Jamestown wasn't just the birthplace of British America. It was also the beginning of something darker, the American system of racial slavery. By 1619, Jamestown was no longer just a ragged outpost clinging to life. It was an economic engine driven by tobacco and powered by labor, both indentured and enslaved. Yet, profit alone couldn't bind a people together. As the distant managers of the Virginia Company in London ignored the colony's needs, the settlers demanded a voice. What they received would shape representative government in British America. In July 1619, Governor George Yardley convened the first General Assembly at the Jamestown Church, bringing together 22 elected representatives from the various settlements along the James River. It was an unprecedented experiment. The settlers themselves chose their own lawmakers to pass ordinances, levy taxes, and address local issues. For more than 3 days, these delegates passed ordinances on land distribution, trade with native tribes, and even penalties for drunkenness. A bitter irony in the colony where wine and tobacco flowed freely. This representative body was not perfect. Voting rights were restricted to free, property-owning men, landowners, or those with a certain tobacco yield. Still, it established a principle. Political power derived from consent, not just royal decree. When new settlers protested unfair taxes or arbitrary arrests, they appealed not to distant company directors, but to their elected delegates. Jamestown residents now had a mechanism to protect their interests if they could maintain it amidst crises. Trouble came quickly. English reinforcements failed to arrive in 1622, and the Powhatan Confederacy launched a coordinated attack that killed a quarter of the colony in a single morning. The General Assembly reconvened at Smith's Hundred, debating emergency measures for defense and welfare. They authorized militia groups, regulated trade licenses, and organized food stores. The Assembly became not just a legislative body, but a lifeline. Still, the Virginia Company's mismanagement continued. Reports of fund abuses, high mortality rates, and inconsistent supplies angered King James I. In 1624, he dissolved the company's charter and declared Virginia a royal colony. Jamestown's governor was now appointed by the Crown, but the General Assembly remained intact, an enduring legacy from 1619. Through the collapse of the charter, deadly attacks, and economic chaos, Jamestown's self-governance proved its worth. The colony had transformed from a private venture to a political community, forging institutions that would outlast its muddy, mosquito-ridden cradle. As tobacco fields expanded and new settlers arrived, the idea that ordinary colonists could elect representatives became woven into the DNA of British America, a seed planted in a battered church at Jamestown, ready to bear fruit in the centuries to come. By the mid-1620s, Jamestown had evolved beyond a struggling outpost into something entirely new, the symbolic and practical heart of British America. Yet, its survival had been brutal. Thousands of lives were lost to starvation, war, disease, and exploitation. Still, the settlement's resilience created a template that would shape future colonies, the United States itself, and the modern world. Jamestown established critical precedents, both good and disturbing. Politically, it pioneered representative government in North America. The General Assembly, founded in 1619, gave settlers a direct voice in local laws and taxation, laying the groundwork for American democracy. It showed the colonists that they could govern themselves, imperfectly, but independently. When tensions eventually rose between the colonies and the British Crown, it was this deep-seated tradition of self-rule that would fuel the revolutionary spirit. Economically, Jamestown's tobacco success was equally influential, tying future American prosperity to agricultural exports. The cultivation of tobacco sparked a plantation economy that demanded immense land and labor. This labor demand initially led to indentured servitude, but quickly accelerated into a full-fledged system of racial slavery that would define the American South for centuries. Culturally, Jamestown also left lasting marks. English traditions, laws, language, and religious practices spread from the muddy banks of the James River to settlements along the Atlantic seaboard and beyond. Yet, it also fostered a culture of violence and racial division exemplified by conflicts with native peoples and the exploitation of enslaved Africans. These early sown seeds would blossom into generations of systemic inequality and struggle. The Powhatan people paid perhaps the highest price. Within decades, disease and conflict had decimated their population, destroying an entire way of life. Jamestown's success, built on tobacco and self-governance, intertwined with this devastating loss, a contradiction that lies at the core of American history. Today, Jamestown is remembered not as a simple triumph, but as a tale of survival, courage, greed, oppression, and innovation. Its legacy lives in the democratic institutions born from its muddy streets, in the cultural exchange that reshaped global history, and in the deep wounds that still mark the national psyche. Ultimately, Jamestown's true legacy is its complexity, a story that is not easily simplified into heroes or villains. Instead, it remains a raw, authentic mirror reflecting what America would become: ambitious, conflicted, inventive, and often painfully human.